exposure classes and kind of a mix table within your specifications. So each needed, but each project will have different values depending on the project requirement. In this example, you can see item 7 here, exterior pavements, does it have of freezing and thawing? So you're going to call out an F3 for your exposure class, and this will dictate the water to cement ratio you need. But there is no need to specifically and explicitly call out the specific water to cement ratio. Item number 8 here, so set targets for carbon footprint. This strategy is for those assessment, experience with EPDs, which is environmental product declarations, which we'll later today, and an understanding of global warming potential for mixes. The big goal here is to resist the temptation to set carbon footprint limits for individual classes of concrete. In effect, this is the same as providing prescriptive limits on the material properties previously mentioned that we don't want to do. It leaves little room for the contractor and as well as to adjust for schedule needs and other things on the project. The best option is building life cycle assessment to set a carbon budget for all concrete on the building. Many concrete companies have published EPDs, so environmental product declarations for concrete, and most would be willing to publish EPDs specifically for a project if needed. NRMCA has published a cradle-to-gate life cycle assessment for ready-mix concrete report, which does have an industry-wide EPD associated with it. So armed with this information, you can conduct an LCA to determine the embodied impacts of concrete of a benchmark building using typical concrete mixes with typical amounts of SCMs as compared to a proposed building concrete slag. Ultimately, you can certain structure. This can basically take in the full takeoff of the actual build. You can ultimately utilize the benchmarks compared to the industry-wide EPDs to product-specific EPDs to establish the goals that you need to set for the project. Once you go through that process and establish structure, you can calculate the carbon footprint for the proposed building. Be set to realize tools, and then list a specific target within your specification as a budgetary approach. In this example, you can see here they're listing little over 4 million kilograms for the carbonation, naturally occurring process. CO2 the surface concrete. For carbonation is a slow process with many variables, and the rate does decrease over time. This is because carbonation itself does decrease permeability, and carbonation does occur from the surface inward, creating a tighter surface matrix and making it more difficult for CO2 to diffuse over time. While slow, though, the carbonation process does result in some uptake of CO2 emitted from cement manufacturing. As previously mentioned, during cement manufacturing, limestone, which is in its chemical form is calcium carbonate, is heated to the point that it is broken down into such things as CO2, and which is kind of the main ingredient within cement. Take is essentially this process in reverse, where basically is how limestone was originally. Atmospheric CO2 progressively diffuses through the concrete surface where it can recombine with calcium products and ultimately form limestone within the concrete surface. And theoretically, given enough time and ideal conditions, all the CO2 emitted from calcination could be sequestered via carbonation. Preliminary estimates put this around this. Other creative ways to leverage carbon uptake is to consider permitting the use of recycled aggregates that are made with demolished concrete. You can basically, these recycled crushed concrete aggregates, RCAs, can be stipulated to be left out and stockpiled for a certain period of time to allow them to carbonate prior to being included into the actual concrete material. So it's kind of a twofold thing where you're offsetting the use of a virgin aggregate while also incorporating an aggregate that has sequestered some CO2 within your concrete well, basement project. Other include carbon process too in the plastic manufacturing. This results in the creation of nanosized particles that can aid in strength gain, or even CO2 curing of concrete materials in a manufacturing environment is another method. Similar processes are being developed and scaled to manufacture artificial limestone aggregates that allow you to essentially add CO2 directly to your concrete in the form of on a per pound basis. I mentioned actively being scaled and researched and have been in the process for some time and uses that same carbonation methodology that I mentioned before. It is also worth noting that the use of exposed concrete on the project, both interior and exterior, is a fantastic promote carbon uptake, also limiting the finished materials that do have a significant CO2 impact to them as well. So number 10 here, encourage innovation. Strategies, this is probably the most challenging. Throughout this presentation, we've talked about the importance of not listing specific products or technologies, instead simply listing the standards that one must. The problem with this approach is that it permits, but does not necessarily encourage or require it. And many innovations might not meet a specific standard. The very similar going back to strategy 1 that Lionel was talking about in terms of communicating your carbon reduction goals. These to your contractors and producers during the design process. Let them know that you are looking for innovative solutions and keep specific goals on carbon reduction. Design charrettes would be a great place to engage engineers and contractors. Ask them to bring these to the table. Most sophisticated experimenting on new formulations all the time in different materials and products and processes at their operation. So ask them to discuss some of these options with you and how you can actually achieve lower carbon content. Ultimately, there is no silver bullet to make concrete footprint. It can be done, but not at the volume and cost demand by today's building owners. Looking through our top 10 list here, these are basically strategies that you can implement now to help work towards our collective goal of reducing the carbon impact of the built environment. That concludes the top 10 ways to reduce concrete's carbon footprint. At this time, we would be happy to answer any questions should anyone have.
Well, excellent presentation, Brandon. And we do have a lot of questions. I'm not sure we're going to be able to get through all of them, but let's go ahead and get started. So there are some general questions about, things like, we're going to get PDHs for these session and so forth. And the answer is yes. If you go to the website, concreteinnovations.com, you'll see a form there you can download to fill in and submit for certification and such. And then we'll PowerPoint presentation. We will distribute those the downloads for PDF of the presentation. We should be able to take care of that for you. So the first question to the presentation itself is, do you have any data on what percentage of suppliers are now offering specific type limestone cement? And Mark saying here it's hard to find. So do you maybe tackle that one, Brandon? I might have a couple of comments to add.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that's coming onto the market more broadly now. California has recently accepted it, and if you look at national acceptance, we're at 48 something states or so that have accepted it from a transportation perspective. As that gearing up to the point where it is going to be sampling small projects here and there as demand is generated, but eventually it will be a full swing switch. They're not going to necessarily manufacture two materials and have the ready mix stock two materials. It will be a more broad change eventually. In the I would say availability is becoming less and less a concern. In fact, a lot of producers that we work with, they want to see adoption quicker rather than slower. So
just say that, just make sure that your spec from CM, C595, and 1157 cements. And you might have a note in there, and this is kind of unusual for a specification, that you prefer the 595 cements. And if you begin to address targets or budgets for a building that are a bit on the, it will encourage the use of those cements that do have a footprint. All right. The other thing where we can we're not you ways, but you can help. The project is being designed, help with the query of what material is available, so that you kind of need to know that, as we pointed out, to try to set target. All right, let's go to another question here. One question was about recommending that specifications include quality control personnel with a certified NRMCA concrete technologist level 2. And if they don't have the certification, are they relying on engineers to give them prescriptive requirements, or else they may not comply with ACI 318? I'm not sure it's about that. Obviously every producer needs to go through the right testing procedures and either, having history of a certain mix to meet the requirements, performance requirements on a project. That's not necessarily what we're trying to get after here. What we're just saying is that just like every other requirement for quality control, quality assurance, is that, the whole idea of trust but verify, right? So it doesn't get by requiring personnel certification or and even an NRMCA plant, but it just like requiring a professional engineer on a project more likely in all. There's another question here about strategies used to reduce embodied carbon in post-tension slabs. Of course, that's one of the, and it's pointed out here that it's one of the trickiest to tackle, and I agree, because obviously there's early strength requirements. So for those of you not familiar with post-tension, a structural engineer needs something like 5,000 PSI at 28 days for design strength, but a contractor, to maintain a schedule, will usually ask for concrete to be 3,000 or 3,500 after 3 days or 2 days, just to maintain schedule, so that they can post-tension that slab. And you're right, it is the one, well, not only the only one, but one of the concretes that is difficult to maintain a carbon footprint that's below a benchmark, the average 5,000 PSI concrete, for example. And I would say there that this is the reason why we suggest doing a carbon budget for the project and not on each specific mix design, because for post-tension, you may have to go above the benchmark. SEMs, and you can be way below the benchmark on that one. But on average, you would be below the benchmark, even though the post-tension slabs might be higher. The other thing to do is talk to your contractor and really ask them, do you really, just like our case study from Los Angeles, they asked the contractor, are you really going to be post-tensioning in 2 days or 3 days, or is it going to be a week? And if it's going to be a week, then why are you asking for this strength at 2 days or 3 days? And oftentimes that's the case. Just like project specifications are copied and pasted from the last project, contractors do the same thing, right? They just always ask for high strength at an early age. Brandon, I don't know if you have anything to add there, but also there was some questions about pre-stressing, and I know.
Yeah, so to add on to that, there's another question here that touches on maturity. I would say I mentioned being surgical in terms of your approach with your ready mix producer. So getting into the mix itself for PT mixes, finding out, one, the time frame needed, incorporating the different materials, add mixtures to add mature in concrete itself as it generates heat while it's hydrating as a mass material, as a whole element, is going to realize better in situ strength than cylinders in many cases. So incorporating that as an acceptable process for 3-day strengths will allow you to work with the ready mix producer to establish a maturity curve that can then be referenced to dictate when you can stress those cables, and ultimately you'll very frequently see that the in situ material is going to have higher early strength than what is tested out in the lab.
Excellent. Well, we've run out of time for this presentation. There's still some questions there, and we'll see if we can't answer them perhaps to the group in writing. Thanks, Brandon. I'd like to the presentation is an owner's perspective, how to be sustainable without sacrificing profit. And it will be presented by Jessica Wilson of CarbonCure and Jeff Small of MDH Partners. They actually pre-recorded their session, so I'm going to play it. Jeff Small wasn't able to be here, but Jessica's here, so at the end she'll be around to answer any questions. So here we go.
Hello, everyone. Welcome today to CarbonCure's webinar, An Owner's Perspective, How to be Sustainable Without Sacrificing Profit. It is my Jr., co-founder and CEO of MDH Partners, here today to discuss his perspective and leadership success stories. Chair and Chief Executive Officer of MDH Partners. His primary responsibilities include leading the strategic directions portfolio, overseeing the pursuit and underwriting of its new acquisitions and developments, as well as managing the relationships with its equity investors. A few impressive and fun facts about Jeff. Jeff is a graduate of Harvard Law School and Yale University. He also holds a master's in religious studies from Oxford University in England. And finally, Jeff and award-winning novels. So it's truly today
Jeff to CarbonCure and looking forward to the conversation.
Awesome. Let's go ahead and begin. So can you tell the audience today, what is the story of MDH Partners? You have a really lovely story. It's a family history involved as well. Could you share that with us today?
Yes. So our origin story definitely is a family business one. My grandfather was a legendary industrial developer in Atlanta from the 1950s through the 1990s, became one of the two largest developers in the Southeast. And his was really a rags to riches story. He never graduated high school. I think he left school in the 8th grade, sold candy door to door, small town in Georgia, and built up a very large industrial company over many decades. And And so I grew up in the family business, hearing it around the dinner table. My high school job in the 1980s was digging ditches and watering trees around his warehouses, whatever kept me outside and got me dirty, he loved. And so I joined the company in the early 90s and then took it over in the mid 90s as his health deteriorated as a much too young CEO. And then sold the family business to a large private equity firm, Blackstone, in 1999, but continued to run it for the next 5 years. And when we sold it a second time in 2005 is when I spun out with a couple of my guys and we started MDH Partners. My grandfather's name was M.D. Hodges. And so that's where I got the MDH from when we started the new company, but brought with us a lot of his values as we kind of made the transition from a sleepy family business to an institutional one with kind of global, equity partners that were just incredible capital partners. We kept a lot of those family roots and values with us as we started growing our business, and we're in 30 cities. We've got about 35 million square feet of warehouses around the country that we're managing and that we develop ourselves, and we do acquisitions. So on behalf of our investors.
I just love that story. Thank you for sharing that with everyone. You mentioned this just a moment ago, but what really drives MDH Partners' core values and ethics? Could you share a little bit about what your values and ethics are?
Sure, and it's so simple and so old-fashioned, and yet I still see people make these mistakes. And my grandfather comes from that generation, growing up out of the Depression, that kind of greatest generation, where if you shook my grandfather's hand, you had a deal, and that he didn't particularly love lawyers. They were kind of a necessary evil, but you'd have a contract. But if you had a deal with him, you had a deal. And that importance of living up to what you say you're going to do and doing the right thing, and watching someone like him, who his reputation was built over decades. It takes a long time to build trust, to build reputation, and one stupid event can ruin a whole reputation if you do something that's unethical or that's shady at all. And so we simply live by that basic philosophy of we do what we say we're going to do. And I think the reason our team is so successful at doing acquisitions around the country, we win a lot of deals where we are not the highest bidder, where we may come in second or even third place, but buyers and the brokers we work with out there know that we will live up to what we say we're going to do. If we say that we're going to pay you $50 million for your portfolio, we're going to close on time and you're going to get $50 million. And so that basic philosophy, and I know we're going to start talking about ESG, kind of permeates that as well. And it's simply of how can we do the right thing in every circumstance. And especially as we're taking on a larger kind of perspective on what our purpose is as a business, and what is the impact that our actions have on our community and the environment and others around us.
Absolutely. Trust is paramount in pretty much any relationship, right? So, and as well as reputation management, which really is a nice segue to ESG initiatives, because that is what is, again, amplifying your reputation and building that trust with your stakeholders. And so as part of this conversation really revolves around ESG, would you please explain to the audience today, why is ESG important and what does it even stand for? I know that it's thrown around a lot in conversations and in business, but oftentimes it's misunderstood. But it's a basic principled concept. Could you share your perspective on ESG?
Sure. I first heard about ESG a number of years ago at a global real estate conference, and it was mainly being talked about from a number of the large European institutions, so the big European pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and it stands for environmental, social, and governance. And it comes from the basic philosophy that these huge institutions with billions of dollars to invest are waking up to the realization that, yes, getting returns for their institutions is important, financial returns, but their money has significant impacts, and it can have global impacts. And when I started hearing about this, it reminded me, my undergraduate days in the mid-1980s was a time where the apartheid regime in South Africa was front and center in the news. And you had this big movement of divesting the university endowments from investing in companies that did business. And so because the business that they did supported the government of South Africa and allowed apartheid to exist. And that divestiture movement was a key piece, along with the rise of Nelson Mandela, Bishop Desmond Tutu, and the visibility. And then all of a sudden you have the corporations around the world pulling out. That created the pressure that literally changed a nation and a people. And so what ESG is, it's recognizing that how we invest our dollars has an impact. And so when I started hearing about these concepts and realizing it's taking its foothold in Europe, but it was only a matter of time before it was going to come to the United States. Our investors today are mainly are 100% nonprofits. So we have large university endowments and big foundations. So it's a very mission-driven investor group, and which I like. It helps, it kind of defines our purpose of we're not just, there's nothing wrong with making billionaires more money, but I do like the fact that that our investors do have these missions of research, student financial aid, and improving the world, but they're getting pressure both from their constituencies, their students, and the world of these endowments have gotten so huge. The largest university endowments in our country are over $40 billion. And so how they invest their money is also impactful. And so, and I think what we're going to see over the next few decades, or few years even, is that push for ESG is going to get more and more granular. We deal with large institutions, but it's going to come to those that deal with smaller institutions and then those that work with us. And but when you step back just from the requirements from the financial side, as I started thinking more about it and kind of getting back to our roots as this family business and the importance of doing the right thing, there's often a hidden cost to doing business that doesn't get taken into account when we run financial models. So for example, if we're going to do a new development, unfortunately, we might have to cut down 100 acres of trees and pave it over. That is not sustainable from an environmental standpoint. And yet we need the warehouses, we need goods. People want their Amazon packages to arrive in their doors every day. And so the economy needs this, but there is a cost to doing that does not get reflected in the financial models. And so I think behind ESG, it's telling us as businesses, we need to start understanding some of those costs. And I think I see it myself as having a duty to my daughter, who's a millennial, to hopefully one day grandkids and then future generations, of leaving the world in a better place rather than a worse place, just for the sake of profit. And it's like at my deathbed, do I want to look back and say I made all of this money, but I created the world is a worse place, because obviously I'm not taking it with me. So there's that multifaceted aspect to it of how we look at ESG.
Yeah, I often try to live my life in the same manner. It's like, when I die, am I going to be proud of these decisions? And you're right, you can build all types of developments, but how do you build a sustainable legacy? I mean, that is truly at the core of my ethics, but I knew that was also at the core of MDH Partners ethics as well. So thank you for sharing that with our audience today. And on that note, would you, kindly highlight a few of your key ESG commitments?
Sure. So we'll get a little bit more on the E side with CarbonCure, because that is a huge one, I think. And this is not blowing smoke because you guys are hosting this webinar, but I think it is the single most impactful ESG thing that we're doing today. But we do a lot of different environmental initiatives that we over-improve our buildings, so there is a cost side of this, and we can talk about the economics of it later. But for example, we'll add clear story windows and skylights to the warehouses. Today, and so if we can improve, the conditions for the workers, our tenants are more likely to be able to hire people. It also allows them, a lot of this LED lights, a lot of those standard things. I think CarbonCure is the most forward-thinking of what we're doing today. On the social side, that includes things like the diversity initiatives. In our business, industrial real estate, historically, we are, to say that we've been kind of the most backwards of the commercial real estate classes, I don't know if it's totally fair, but typically, real estate in general hasn't been in the forefront of technology and a lot of kind of a little bit slower to adapt to kind of the changing modern world. And industrial real estate within commercial real estate, we're a little bit more of the old-fashioned, kind of, jeans and boots warehouse people. And so we've made a concerted effort at our company to really work on bringing more women into our business. Like in the retail real estate world, you see a lot of women, industrial, not as many. And so it's about, finding really talented people. It means that we may not find someone with all the experience, but we can find someone really smart, that's hardworking, that's interesting, that culturally fits with us, whether they're a female, a person of color, and then we have a training program and we will train them in order that they can, learn to love what we do, but also, get exposure to world-class kind of real estate private equity investing in a way that they might not normally have access to. So that's a big piece of the social stuff. The G for governance is a big piece of that is aligning interests with our investors, and a big piece of that is just transparency. A big piece of my job is communicating with customers, with our investors, and it's just about being open. So, which again kind of goes back to that old-fashioned family roots. Here we work with world-class investors, and I'm using kind of lessons from the 1950s, small-town Georgia, in a way. So it seems quaint, but again, it's about if you want people to give you hundreds of millions of dollars to invest, they need to have that absolute trust in you. And that means that not everything always goes right. And so, as we're being very transparent and communicating, it's a problem and things aren't going right. And that something that we're thinking about here.
Excellent, thank you. And we mentioned this earlier, we're going to now focus a lot of the conversation around the E commitments, the environmental initiatives at MDH Partners. Why across your portfolio have you embraced green building and clean technologies?
So, yeah, we invest money in a number of different ways. One is we will buy older buildings, maybe that were built from the 1960s through the 80s, that we come in and rehab and make more efficient and repurpose them for a more modern use. And that, by that very nature of doing that work, it's sustainable. So you're taking, an older asset, and maybe just from a lighting standpoint, it might have old metal halide, energy efficient lights in it. We swap them out to LEDs and we put new reflective roofs on them. And in doing that, we're making them more adaptable to today's, by the repurposing and modernizing it, they're becoming much more efficient assets as well. We're also developers, though. And as I mentioned a little while ago, if you're going to, take a virgin piece of land and pave over it for new buildings, that yes, it's critical for our infrastructure of the economy. And to me, that's one of the most interesting things about industrial real estate. It's, our buildings, yes, they're not the sexiest architecture in the world. We build concrete boxes, but it's what goes on inside the buildings that's so interesting. It's literally the backbone of the global economy of what happens in these buildings. And they're absolutely necessary, but we do have to think about, and if we're cutting down trees, have a vital source of producing oxygen and removing carbon from the atmosphere, we look at ways, can we start to reduce that carbon footprint? So some of the things that we're doing, we've connected another Atlanta-based company, Interface. They do flooring. We've just completely switched over. We're only using, they have a carpet that is carbon negative. So as part of the manufacturing process, it removes carbon. And then they have tiles, LVTs, that are carbon neutral. So we've now made a commitment. We're only using them going forward in all the office build outs. But I think the most revolutionary thing, and obviously as we do the efficient lighting and HVAC systems and gray water, all of that helps to mitigate your impact, but you're still impacting a green site. So what was so intriguing to me about CarbonCure when I first started learning about it a couple of years ago and why we've used it, this is one of our assets. It's just north of Charlotte, near Lake Norman in Huntersville. We just delivered 2 buildings there. And we used CarbonCure there, and it was the fact of your process, which is actually removing what would be CO2 going into the atmosphere as part of the manufacturing process of the concrete. And that, you could go and, take a wrecking ball to the building and it becomes dust. That CO2 that would be in the atmosphere is never released back into the atmosphere. And so, I think that, on these assets in here in just north of Charlotte, and then the ones that the one we did in outside of Nashville, I think it was maybe the equivalent of like planting 300 acres of trees, but it was a 20-acre development site. So of the amount of carbon that we could remove, from the atmosphere through the use of your technology. I don't understand why you are not in all 50 states and everyone is not using your technology. So that's why I'm doing this. We don't look at ESG as this is a proprietary thing for MDH where, do we get an advantage with, some more sophisticated tenants that are coming in that, yes, they're more likely to want to be in our building because of what we're doing. And that when we go to sell it one day, other big institutional investors will like that as well. I don't think about it like that it's proprietary, that we want to hold this to ourselves. I want to spread the message so that other people, can do the same thing, because it's how, as an industry, we can move forward and do something better for the world. And yes, there's benefits for us. It will help, I think, change the image. Sometimes, as developers and contractors, we don't, in the broader kind of environmental sphere, we can be painted in a negative light. But I think that how we can approach this together is a way that we can move forward in a really positive way where we're supporting the economy and we're doing right by the environment and our future generations.
I completely agree. Sustainable development is truly the right way to build, even if you're going into a green site and developing. Of course, that's not ideal in a perfect world, but nonetheless, it's what we need as a society. And so how can we, again, mitigate those environmental impacts of development? So thank you for using CarbonCure, and ideally we would be in all 50 states, and we hope that folks on the line today will hear that call to action and hopefully on board with us, because again, it's a great investment. And from your perspective, with regards to return on investment, we can talk about green technologies, but with CarbonCure and other, I'd say, green building initiatives like your third-party certifications, have you found an ROI with regards to tenant satisfaction and leasing as well?
I feel like we're still early in that, and it's hard to measure. I had a interesting conversation a couple of years ago with one of my investors, one of the large endowments, and we were talking about sustainability issue. And I asked them of how many basis points of a return will you be willing to sacrifice for me to build greener buildings? Because there's a lot that you can do that cost a lot of money. And the answer I got back was, in an ideal world, we could figure out ways in which we can keep our returns, but also be greener. And that's what you guys, and in both of our cases, I think in the Nashville case, it was basically a wash from a cost standpoint. It didn't cost us any more to use CarbonCure. And it was a small premium in Charlotte, but it was so small, it was a rounding error. And so, to get an extra basis point there versus the impact that we can use, from a financial model, it's a no-brainer. But we have started to see, it's interesting, from tenants that that get excited that when they hear about it, and that there's definitely deals in both of those buildings that I think we got done faster because of the large corporations that were moving in there that really liked that story. Did we get an extra 5 cents in rent? I can't quantify that, but we did the deal. I think it'll be interesting when they go to sell, kind of what, again, it's, is there a small cap rate difference or not? I don't know. But if it gets people more excited about your assets, whether they're a tenant or an investor, we've also, a huge surprise, a benefit that we've seen is from the banks that lend us money. And when we're starting to do this, because the banks are under a lot more pressure to be more sustainable in terms of how they do loans, and we've had a number of lenders reach out to us and say, look, we think we can actually give you better loan terms, and have started breaking out in the packages that we give to the banks on our deals of what are the ESG focused initiatives in whether it's a redevelopment or development that we're doing. And we never, when we started using it, that wasn't even on our radar screen. And it was as the banks heard about what we were doing, they came to us and said when they wanted to use us as an example. There's real financial returns from all of that. It's just hard to quantify. But I think the bigger picture is this is the direction the world is going to. And you can get on board or be left behind. And we wanted to be more on the cutting edge of that, rather than trying to play catch up later.
That's a great, again, segue to a shift in the conversation. And it really goes back to the beginning of our conversation, which is about core ethics and business principles. And as we wrap up our conversation, I do want to bring that home because we've talked a lot about really non-traditional type of returns on investment and really how the future is headed in that direction. So in thinking beyond traditional ROI to consider doing what's right by your investors and your community, how does leading with intention, again, define your legacy of leadership at MDH?
Again, it is about how do I want to look back at the end of my career and say, what was my purpose? What is the meaning behind what I've done? And part of it is creating a company and giving younger people that work for us, new career starts, and hopefully they'll continue the legacy, whether it's at MDH or some future organization of mentoring them. And I think a lot about leading is there's a lot of talk around ESG, and a new term I've heard recently is greenwashing. And basically, it's kind of window dressing of trying to appear green or more sustainable, and you're not really having an impact. I think leadership, it's not just saying what you're going to do, but it's really taking strong affirmative steps and demonstrating it. And then I think it's more important maybe to talk after you've done it than talk before what you're going to do, which is why we're having this conversation now. We didn't broadcast our ESG efforts until we really started doing them. And now we do that not to build PR just for the company, although, frankly, it certainly helps, but it's about can we spread this message of, hey, here's some practices that we're discovering and it's working for us. You guys can do it as well. And I think it's that leading of setting the goals of, as an organization, we're going to make these strides. I talk about it a lot within the organization. Everybody knows about it. They probably get tired of hearing me talk about it. But then it's about let's actually do it, and then let's celebrate it when we do it and let people know.
Excellent. And then finally, before we just have a question, and if we didn't get to questions from today, we will definitely respond to you afterwards. But as a call to action to wrap our conversation, how would you empower any type of company, be it private or public, small or large, to really embrace this purpose-driven leadership that we've been discussing today as a real business opportunity? How do they start their journey?
Yeah, I think you start small. It's one step at a time. You mentioned I published a couple novels. I'm a writer in my spare time. It's one of my great hobbies that I've loved. And people ask me, how can you write a 400-page novel? And it's written one page at a time. And so the same, it doesn't matter the size of your organization. In the private equity world, we're a small shop. We have 23 people, and that's grown from 7 people 3 years ago. And we have great investors, but relative to the Blackstones of the world and these big New York shops, we're very, very small. And yet our goal is to have an outsized impact. So it's finding those small areas, and anyone can use CarbonCure. You don't have to be building multiple million square feet to use CarbonCure. So you can use sustainable tiles. You can do all of these small steps. Anyone listening to this can make those differences, and I think it's just one day at a time. That one pass, one small action leads to the next action.
Yeah, just mastering the small, right? It's crucial just in starting somewhere. Well, thank you so much. We have a few minutes. I do want to open up the conversation to some questions here.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica and Jeff, for an outstanding presentation. We don't have that much time for questions, but we can answer one. Of course, you can probably understand, Jessica, that most questions were geared towards CarbonCure and what percentage reduction in carbon emissions and so forth that it provides. Let me just preface the question by saying that just like all of the other solutions we talked about in the presentation before, most of them are, I would say, additive, which is great. In other words, they're not mutually exclusive and you can use them together. And CarbonCure is an example of that. And then, of course, the theme of the entire presentation is about transparency, which will be the topic of our next discussion on environmental product declarations, but also throughout the presentation, throughout the conference, we will talk about transparency and how you make declarations about environmental impacts and social impacts and governance impacts as part of the whole presentation, sessions coming up. So anyway, Jessica, getting to the question, talk a little bit about CarbonCure and how it works in concrete. I know that's probably hard to do in just a minute or two, but see if you can't answer that. Yeah.
Thank you. I see a lot of questions. I've tried to answer it as thoroughly as possible in the chat, but to give a very basic description of CarbonCure, we take CO2 from large industrial manufacturing facilities that are typically required to cap their CO2 regardless. Okay, so this is an existing supply chain of CO2. That CO2 has been historically used by the carbonated beverage industry. So fun fact, every time you drink a seltzer or any type of carbonated beverage, that is purified post-industrial grade CO2. And so we're tapping into that existing CO2 supply chain. Now, ideally, there will be other sources of CO2, including captured CO2 from atmospheric conditions, which we're getting there as an industry. We're not there yet. But nonetheless, that CO2 is transported to a producer partner site. We do not create concrete as a company. We rather partner with producers in respective communities. That CO2 is injected in both wet and dry processes, also in precast, and I can share more information post this call. But nonetheless, when you add CO2, it improves the compressive strength of concrete without impacting the fresh or hardened properties or the performance of concrete. So as Lionel, you mentioned, this is really an effort to compound carbon savings across the board. And so with that being said, CarbonCure is complementary with SCMs, and we encourage all types of innovative technologies around reducing the overall carbon footprint of concrete. We are one solution to helping the end user really get there in terms of embodied carbon reduction. And I can share a lot more on CarbonCure, but unfortunately we are out of time today. But if there are any questions, I'm happy to address those offline.
Yeah, we'll make sure that we provide Jessica's contact information, but also, Jessica, why don't you mention your website?
Sure. It's carboncure.com. If you go there, you can see what producers currently have CarbonCure available in your markets. And also there's a myriad of resources for you on what happens when CO2 is injected, the difference between early carbonation and atmospheric carbonation. I see a lot of chat in the chat over there about that. But yeah, carboncure.com. I'll share that as well.
All right. So also, that's great. If you go to the website for the conference, concreteinnovations.com, there is a product spotlight that I believe, Jessica, you are indicated there with your email address and so forth. So
sure.
Perhaps you'll be inundated with emails.
Hopefully. I welcome it. Thank you. Thank you
All
for
right.
having us.
Yeah, excellent presentation. Thank you. So as I mentioned, this whole discussion of transparency and environmental impacts are just one component of this whole environmental social governance discussion, but they're an important one, right? Especially for construction. So our next presentation is on the topic of the NRMCA industry-wide environmental product declaration for concrete and how it's used. Our speakers today are Matthew LeMay and Katie Post of NRMCA. So please welcome Matthew and Katie to present.
Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew LeMay. I'm the manager of codes and sustainability programs at NRMCA. And today with my colleague Katie, we're going to be presenting on environmental product declarations, or EPDs. We're going to be running over what they are and how to use them. And we're also going to be highlighting two publications of NRMCA, the industry-wide EPD or industry average EPD, and our benchmark report. So before we discuss EPDs, it's necessary to touch on LCAs. This stands for Life Cycle Assessment. This is a document that is a required predecessor to producing an EPD. They are an objective scientific process that's guided by international standards, specifically the ISO 14040 series of standards, 14041, 42, etc. They investigate and evaluate all of the environmental impacts of a product, process, or service. In this case, it's a volume of ready-mix concrete that we're talking about. They measure the inputs and outputs of all of that product's life stages and the interrelation between those stages. And they allow a practitioner to make an informed, responsible, and balanced decision to deliver a product with optimized environmental performance. The phrase life cycle in life cycle assessment refers to the life stages of a product, which you can see visualized in the central column here on the right. These include the acquisition of raw materials, manufacturing, the operations of a building, which include maintenance and repair on the building, and then end-of-life recycling and waste management, recycling the building materials once you've demolished it. The output of an LCA can be thought of as a wide-ranging environmental footprint of a building. It accounts for carbon emissions, waste products, co-products, and other releases. These outputs are then converted into potential environmental impacts based on scientific knowledge of how these outputs affect the planet, ecosystems, and human health. This can be applied to any product. There are LCAs out there for consumer goods like paper, for construction materials like concrete, or for actual entire buildings. We'll have an LCA summarizing the outputs of the process of manufacturing that entire building. So now on to EPDs, or Environmental Product Declaration. That's what EPD stands for. This is a companion to LCAs, which comes afterwards. It is an EPD is a communications document, which communicates the findings of an LCA to a third party. That third party could be a contractor asking for environmental impacts in the spec. That could be a certification program like LEED, or it could be a government regulatory agency. My colleague Katie later in this presentation will go over some of the different use cases for EPDs. Like LCAs, EPDs are also governed by international ISO standards. But in addition, EPDs for concrete are governed by something called the PCR, or Product Category Rule. This is a set of rules to determine how EPDs are formatted and the data that they report specific to ready-mix concrete. And NRMCA takes a leading role on the committee which develops and publishes the concrete PCR for EPDs. Another way to think about EPDs is to think about it like a nutrition label. But instead of reporting nutrients and calories, it reports environmental impacts of a building product instead of a food item. The top line, the big that you look at on a nutrition label, is calories. For an EPD, the top line that is most commonly looked at is global warming potential, which is the topic of this whole session today is about global warming potential. That's the one that the market is most interested in, but it's not the only thing reported on an EPD. So EPDs can be defined to have different scopes. And these are based on which inputs and outputs and which stages of the construction process they take into account. This diagram breaks down the life cycle stages, which are defined by the standards underlying LCAs and EPDs. Each of these stages and substages can have a positive carbon impact, or causing emissions, or even a negative impact in the case of carbon sequestration or recovered energy or recycling. Cradle to gate refers to the first product stage only. The gate in this phrase refers to the factory gate when a product leaves the gates. At present, this is the scope of NRMCA's industry-wide EPD, and I would say the majority of concrete EPDs, which means that it summarizes the impacts of concrete when it's manufactured and delivered to a site, but not the environmental impacts afterwards. As we know, those can include carbon uptake, recycling, etc., which means that a wider scope, one like cradle to grave, which includes disposal and use, would actually could potentially benefit a lower GWP total. Then finally, cradle to cradle is an extension of that cradle to grave scope, which refers to the reuse of materials in creating new materials later and accounting for the carbon savings from reuse. As we develop future editions of the product category rule, we hope to expand from the cradle to gate scope to a more inclusive and broader scope. So the first type of EPDs that we're going to cover, of 3, are product-specific EPDs. These are EPDs that use data specific to a ready-mix producer that develops it. And in most cases, that data is specific to one facility owned by that ready-mix producer. Each facility might have different material suppliers, a different electrical grid, and different transportation distances for its material supply, which means that it's going to have a different environmental impact, right? If you transport a material from further away, it burn more emissions bringing it to the plant. Each product-specific EPD can contain environmental impact data for multiple concrete mixes that are based on that underlying plant data. So one EPD might include many mixes. Traditionally, these were produced as PDF documents that had to be written up by a professional. Now there are several online tools, software tools on the market to create and store EPD data online. Because of how specific product-specific EPDs are, they have to be produced by an LCA and EPD practitioner, and they have to be verified by a third-party verifier to ensure compliance with ISO standards and with the PCR. NRMCA is a program operator for product-specific EPDs. And what that practically means is that we facilitate the verification of these EPDs, which allows them to actually be used on the market. So I'm going to overview the process of producing and verifying a product-specific EPD. The first step, the practical first step you could take is to contact NRMCA, and we will be able to walk you through this process. But so the first step in the process, if you're a ready-mix producer, is that you would contract directly with an LCA and EPD practitioner. There are some larger companies that are pointed out on this slide. They are not the only options, but Athena, Sustainable Materials Institute, and Climate Earth are among them. As a ready-mix producer, you would supply 12 months of operations data from the plant or plants where you're looking to produce these EPDs for, including materials, energy consumption, water consumption, transportation, etc., to the LCA practitioner. The result would be that they would then produce an LCA report that underlies the EPD and a draft of the EPD. From this point, with these documents, as a ready-mix producer, you would then contract with NRMCA to have the EPD verified. That's the role of NRMCA as a program operator. So to ensure fairness, NRMCA contracts with a third-party verifier, which is not the same company as produced the LCA. And we select them largely at random, again, to ensure fairness. The third-party verifier corrects any errors in the EPD and ensures that it complies with ISO standards and the product category rule. And the final result is you get this stamp on your EPD, which means it is verified product-specific EPD, and you're ready to use it for any of those use cases that we have mentioned and that Katie will talk about in more depth. Okay. For this next part, I am going to touch on the industry-wide or industry average EPD. This is an NRMCA publication that is distinct from, but a companion to product-specific EPDs. Starting in 2014, we began publishing this industry average EPD for ready-mix concrete. What it is it's an EPD based on a representative statistical sample of the entire ready-mix concrete industry. The goal is a document that producers can use for business-to-business communication to convey the environmental impacts of concrete without necessarily needing to produce a product-specific EPD. Katie will later discuss the best use cases for a product-specific EPD versus the industry average EPD. It's based on data that's current within 5 years, and we conduct a very large survey of the ready-mix industry to gather up all of this data and produce a robust average, essentially. So when data is 5 years old, we redo the survey and gather it anew. This captures changes to the electrical grid, changes to material supply, and changes to the technology in use at batch plants in the present day. So NRMCA conducts a survey of the entire ready-mix industry that includes 198 companies. They represent 1,961 plants in this current edition. And any companies which participated in that survey can then use the industry-wide EPD to represent their concrete, essentially, and its environmental impacts. The data gathered is the same as for a product-specific EPD, 12 months of operations data, which includes energy and water consumption, emissions and waste generated at the plant, material supplies, and their transportation distances. This also underwent the same verification process as a product-specific EPD to ensure its compliance with standards. So this data is valid and recognized throughout the industry. As a companion to the industry-wide EPD, NRMCA also developed the Regional Benchmark Report. It's an appendix or companion to the same document. What this does is it takes the same data gathered through that very wide industry survey, and it breaks it down into 8 regions. The reason for this is that almost all, essentially, of the data relevant to a ready-mix plant is local. The local grid, power consumption, what % of your energy is renewables versus fossil fuels, your material supply distances. In some regions, they have an abundant supply of particular aggregates or SCMs. In other regions, you have to ship them from further away, which contribute to different carbon emissions by region. So the regional benchmark summarizes the same industry averages as the industry-wide EPD, but it provides a more specific picture to each region. To wrap this up, the chart that you see on the bottom right there represents the carbon footprint of concrete over time as measured by our industry-wide EPD. As you can see, so this is all ready-mix concrete produced in the industry, essentially. As you can see, it's dropped off pretty rapidly in only 7 years, which is a big win for our sustainability. The only reason that we're able to gauge that is because of this industry-wide EPD survey and the wide participation in it. And it really helps us to target very aggressive, progressive carbon emissions reduction goals for the future. NRMCA really started on this project toward carbon neutral in 2009 by adopting a 30% reduction goal by 2030. And that's a 30% reduction of carbon emissions as well as energy use, water, and waste goals that come along with it. But we soon realized that we could do better. And that goal was not aggressive enough. We committed in 2012 to the Architecture 2030 Challenge for Products, which has a goal of 50% carbon emissions by 2030 and carbon neutrality by 2050. And if you take a look at the projected chart based on our industry-wide EPD on the bottom right, we're on track, which is great news for the industry. The 2030 Challenge actually urged manufacturers to use life cycle assessments and EPDs. And that was a driver for our EPD program, which we launched in 2014, alongside our publication of the first industry-wide EPD. So far, we've demonstrated a 21% decrease in carbon footprint in the 7 years that we've run that program. In 2016, we launched Build with Strength to reach out to producers to communicate, advocate, and educate for concrete sustainability through transparency to support carbon reduction goals. And in 2021, just last year, we reaffirmed our commitment to carbon neutrality when we joined with PCA, Portland Cement Association, to develop the 2050 roadmap to carbon neutrality, which targets that same 50% or that same carbon neutral goal by 2050 in the 2030 challenge. From here, I am going to pass on my presentation to my colleague, Katie Poss, who's going to talk about how to use these best use cases for these different documents.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Hello, everyone. My name is Katie Poss. I just joined the NRMCA about a month ago. I am the Director of Sustainability Initiatives. Prior to joining NRMCA, I worked with a general contractor where throughout the last year or so, I was almost 100% focused on estimating and reducing the embodied carbon at a project and program level. So I understand firsthand how complicated this rapidly evolving topic can be. So hopefully today's session will provide you with some practical knowledge and resources that you can begin to apply on your projects immediately. So I want to start with just a little bit of a crash course in embodied carbon, some of the frequently used acronyms which you've heard throughout the day, and the basic formula for calculating. So GWP, again, is global warming potential. That metric can be found on an EPD. EC, embodied carbon, the unit of measure, which I saw a question about earlier, that we use to express embodied carbon is kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, this kgCO2e here. And yes, this does include the impacts of all of the greenhouse gases that are contributing to climate change, like methane, even water vapor, not just carbon dioxide. EPD is Environmental Product Declaration. IW stands for industry-wide, and PS, product-specific. So the mechanics of disclosing a product's carbon footprint and the ability to optimize, whether it's in green building rating systems or due to some of the policies we're seeing throughout the country, this comes from verifiable, quantifiable metrics, such as the data included in these environmental product declarations. Each mix performs a specific function, therefore each mix of concrete is a specific product. And as Matthew explained earlier, we have created benchmarks in all regions of the United States so that our producers and specifiers and project stakeholders can better understand reduction goals that are regionally specific and feasible in a given location. So why are there so many different documents, and when and how should you use this information on a project? Okay, we'll start with the regional and national benchmark report. This represents industry averages, and we have published multiple iterations of this. And what we're seeing, as Matthew explained, is that the data is trending downwards, which is great news. So first and foremost, this document can be used within the industry to track how well we're progressing towards our own goals. Now, you can also use this data to compare the information in an industry-wide EPD or a product-specific EPD to the national or regional average to understand how your specific product is comparing to the average in your market. Now, there are multiple different documents out there that use the same rigorous LCA methodologies to calculate benchmarks and average GWP and other environmental impacts. And examples could be those developed by state and local ready-mix concrete associations, design or engineering groups, or federal, state, and local government entities. But I think what's important here is just to establish something as the basis for your embodied carbon budget determination and for communicating your reduction. Whenever I see something publicized as we reduce our embodied carbon by 20%, my first question is, from what? We always have to define that from what that we're communicating that percentage reduction from. Just to note that we do have an excellent publicly available free embodied carbon guide to specs, which provides detailed guidance and example spec language, and that can be downloaded from our website. Okay, so the industry-wide EPD can serve a number of purposes, and it can help a project achieve points in third-party rating systems such as LEED or Green Globes just by submitting this document itself. And note that only ready-mix suppliers that provided data to develop the industry-wide EPD are allowed to submit these documents on projects pursuing these third-party certifications. So for all of you contractors out there who are collecting these LEED or Green Globe submittals, make sure you check that the ready-mix supplier actually participated. And a list of those suppliers can also be found on our website. So the industry-wide EPD should be used during the design stage to help with carbon budgeting. And as Lionel mentioned earlier, it's more effective to set a total carbon budget for the entire concrete scope rather than setting GWP limits on individual strength classes. So we'll get into product-specific EPDs shortly, but I do want to note that while having product-specific EPDs during pre-con might be ideal from an accurate carbon accounting perspective, the NRMCA recommends that you utilize the industry-wide EPD during project planning for budgeting purposes. This is for a number of reasons. First of all, it is not standard practice for a ready-mix supplier to know exactly what mix designs they plan to use for a project early in design or in the bid phase. Typically, mix designs are submitted during the submittal process during construction. But if you know the strength class and you know your target SCM content, you can use the industry-wide EPD to set a carbon budget for the concrete scope and work with the concrete contractor and the GC and the ready-mix supplier to establish that concrete budget, the carbon budget during pre-con. And as the project progresses and the ready-mix supplier starts to develop their mix designs, they will be able to develop their mixes within the set carbon budget. So again, product-specific EPDs are the most accurate representation of environmental impacts, and these should be collected during the submittal process. Now you can use the data in the product-specific EPD to confirm that your goals that were established during pre-construction are met. Product-specific EPDs are accepted by tools such as the EC3 calculator to demonstrate an embodied carbon reduction. The product-specific EPD can also be used for third-party rating systems. And just to note that in LEED, product-specific EPDs are actually weighted a little heavier than industry-wide EPDs. Okay, let's talk through a couple of examples. So let's say we have a project in the design phase in California, and it's trying to determine what the embodied carbon reduction would be for a 5,000 PSI mix that uses 40% slag as an SCM. First, reference the benchmark report. Here you can find what the global warming potential of a 5,000 PSI mix is in the Pacific Southwest region. And that is 288.90 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per cubic yard. Then reference the industry-wide EPD and find the GWP of a 5,000 PSI mix with a 40% slag content. You can then calculate the percentage reduction, and the result is a 14% lower carbon footprint as compared to the 2021 regional benchmark. Okay, so the same project is progressing and trying to determine what they've already poured concrete, they've gone through the submittal process. They want to confirm that what the actual embodied carbon reduction was. So they are using the same benchmark, 288.90. And then they have a product-specific EPD for the 5,000 PSI mix with a 40% slag content that was used on the project. You notice anything different here? This declared unit on the product-specific EPD is in meters cubed. So far, our calculations have been in cubic yards. I'm going to stick with cubic yards because that's what we use here, which isn't confusing at all when you're working on projects overseas, but I digress. So you're going to need to do some conversions here. If you want to convert a GWP from per meter cubed, you would multiply that by 0.765, and the result is 185.9 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent per cubic yard. And what we see here is that the actual embodied carbon of the mix we used was higher than what we estimated in pre-con, which is always good. Okay, in this next example, we're going to talk through the impact of using higher volumes of SEMs in concrete. And in this example, a cradle-to-gate LCA was conducted to determine the embodied impacts of concrete on a building that compares the GWP of a reference building with moderate SEM content to a proposed building using concrete mixes with relatively high volumes of fly ash and slag. The building in the study is an 18-story residential tower located in the Northeast United States. And for illustration purposes, we only selected 6 mix designs. In reality, a project of this size may have more than 6 mixes. On the chart on the left, the compressive strengths and concrete volumes for each structural element are identified. Now, the first step is to identify your typical concrete mixes used for the reference building. This example uses the benchmark mix designs for the Northeast region. The next step is to develop mix designs that have a lower GWP than the benchmark, but still meet the performance criteria. We have to maintain strength, durability. There's oftentimes, a schedule component that really needs to be considered, especially as we increase SCM content. So keep in mind that concrete requiring high early strength should be limited to maybe around 30% replacement of fly ash or slag. But concrete that does not require that high early age strength, such as footings, basement walls, even some vertical elements like columns and shear walls, those could have as much as 70% fly ash and or slag, and consider allowing those to be tested at 56 or 90 days instead of 28 days to account for that slower strength gain. Okay, so in this example, we used the Athena Impact Estimator software, and both the reference building mixes and the proposed building mixes were input into the software. And the Athena Impact Estimator actually has the NRMCA benchmark mixes and the industry-wide EPD mixes preloaded into the software. And the software also permits the user to select pre-existing mixes from a library, or you can generate completely new mixes. So if you have the concrete producer on board, and I like to think of this as sort of a design assist, if your project has carbon reduction goals, consider bringing that concrete contractor and ready mix supplier on board early when you're doing something like a whole building LCA to help develop mix designs that are project specific and calculate what the potential reduction could be. So once all the concrete information is defined for each project, the user can then run a report that will provide the estimated GWP along with the other environmental impact categories for each building. The reference building will represent the larger impacts because we used smaller amounts of SEMs, and the proposed building had resulted in lower impacts. And the results in this example indicated that the reference building has a GWP for concrete of 6.14 million kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, while the proposed building has a GWP of roughly 3.92 million kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalent, meaning that the higher volumes of fly ash and slag resulted in a 36% lower GWP for the concrete scope. Now keep in mind that this example was simplified for illustration purposes, and it only considered the effects of concrete. But specifically for the LEED credit, you have to model all of the structure and enclosure materials. So you would need to add things like reinforcing steel, structural steel, fireproofing, all of your exterior cladding materials such as glass, aluminum, and insulation. And the Athena Impact Estimator software does have most commonly used materials built in. Okay, let's talk just briefly about policy. This is kind of a hot topic, and as you all are probably aware, legislators and regulators are already proposing action and putting policies into place, such as Buy Clean Colorado, which sets GWP limits for materials like concrete and asphalt, and the Marin County Low Carbon Concrete Policy in California. And many of these policies are requiring that product-specific EPDs be submitted to demonstrate compliance. And finally, hot off the press, just last month, the General Services Administration issued new standards for reducing the carbon footprint of their buildings and infrastructure projects. This includes an energy efficiency standard and a low embodied carbon concrete standards. Now, these standards are in alignment with Architecture 2030, which sets targets for reducing operational emissions and embodied carbon emissions of their projects. The new concrete standard specifies maximum GWP limits for commonly specified compressive strengths. We did evaluate these, and the targets are generally higher than the industry average benchmarks that we published in our LCA report. Now, producers, again, must demonstrate compliance with the standard by submitting third-party verified product-specific EPDs that have been developed in conformance with the North American PCR for concrete. The NRMCA did consult with the GSA during the specification development process, and we encouraged our members to respond to a survey that the GSA sent out earlier this year. The results of that survey indicated that over 80% of the concrete manufacturers who responded are already producing or supplying some form of lower embodied carbon materials. Over 60% said that they have developed a product-specific EPD already, and over 55% said that their low embodied carbon concrete costs about the same as conventional equivalents. And if I'll put my GC hat on here for a moment, on a given project, almost every time we got the most bang for our buck in optimizing concrete mix designs to drive the total carbon footprint down of a project. I think we're going to continue to see this trend in public and private policies being put into place related to embodied carbon and sustainability in general. So, investing in transparency of materials using tools like LCAs and EPDs is a critical first step. And then employing reduction strategies, such as the ones we heard about in the session earlier from Lionel and Brandon, is equally crucial as we work towards the collective goal of getting the footprint of concrete down to zero. And with that, I hope we have some time for questions.
Great presentation, Matthew and Katie. Yeah, we do have time for questions. And let's start with this one for Katie. You talked about the benchmarks, obviously the industry-wide benchmarks that we developed, but you also showed GSA and talked about some of the other state and local regulatory initiatives that may have different benchmarks. Why is that? Why is there not a single benchmark that one can refer to for concrete?
That's a good question. Wouldn't it be great if we just had one? I think ultimately it's up to the regulating body or the specifier as to what they want to define the benchmark as and what data set they're using. And just a note on our benchmarks, that is the average. It's essentially the 50th percentile. So I would not recommend setting a GWP benchmark any lower than that. But some of these others, like I think the CLF baselines and some others that are out there like GSA, as we mentioned, are generally higher than our industry average benchmarks, maybe at that 80th percentile. So they're more achievable, if that makes sense.
All right. This one's for Matthew, and it has to do with what Katie talked about, well, and maybe you talked about, and that is the process and when you should be asking for product-specific EPD. So this has to do with about how much time does it take once a company decides they have to produce a product-specific EPD. What's the time frame to get that done generally?
Yeah, it varies widely based on how many plants and how many mix designs are being incorporated into that. But in our experience, it takes at least several months to gather those 12 months of operating, that 12 months of operating data. You generally are able to get this data looking backwards. rather than like from energy consumption and things that are measured that way. So when we say 12 months of operating data, you don't start monitoring and it takes 12 months to gather all of that. It's less than that, but it's still complex, and it takes several months to gather that data, maybe an extra month to actually develop the LCA, and then a couple of weeks to have the EPD verified.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Katie talked about, when to use the industry-wide EPD data, which has, of course, various mixed designs that you can use as surrogates for a product-specific EPD in the design stage. Sometimes producers do have a wide range of product-specific EPDs already that you could probably tap into. And if you're collaborating with them in the design stage, that would be another source of data. There's the EC3 tool that Katie talked about as another potential source, but make sure that you're using data that's from your region, specifically as possible, because the environmental impacts do depend on the local materials that are available to producers. I guess I would reiterate what Katie talked about, which is in design, use what's available and don't ask producers to produce a product-specific EPD specifically at bid, because that's really hard to do. But of course, in the spec, like Brandon and I talked about, you may require it, but it's going to be at time of submittal. So just like before, where you're submitting the mix design at the same time as a product-specific EPD, as long as that's communicated to the producer and contractor, then they have time to get that done. Once they know more about what the mix design is. Talk a little bit about, again, the idea of this whole concept of on-demand EPDs, because I think that's the trend, right?
Yeah, of course. So I touched on the fact that in the past, these used to be written up as an EPD document in kind of a report format. And now the trend is toward using these online software tools, and those are called on-demand EPDs, is one of the most common ways to refer to them. What these do is essentially allow the producer to put all of their plant data and their materials and such into one of these online tools. And I think the two largest on the market, don't quote me on this, are going to be Athena, the Athena Impact Estimator, and Climate Earth publishes a tool as well. I believe it's called Climate Clarity. Essentially, all of the data, all the plant data, will be put into the tool for a given plant, and then when it comes time to actually design a mix using materials you already have and such, you would be able to design that mix in this EPD software. And then it would be able to give you a pre-verified EPD because all of your plant data was verified when you got this set up with the tool, essentially. And then from there, you can even use this to model mixes. You can produce a mix without actually making it, right? By putting its materials into the software, and then it will be able to tell you what your environmental impacts are going to be. And then when you come to the mix that you actually are going to use, you can generate an EPD, and it genuinely can be a couple of clicks to have an EPD that you can then have sent off that will come out verified because your tool and your plant data was verified when you got this set up. And then you can go ahead and use it. It's really great, and we hope to that this keeps up and only gets easier in the future.
Excellent. So, Katie, one last question. Let's talk a little bit about, I know you touched on this, you mentioned the impact estimator, Athena impact estimator. Are there other tools that you could use currently that would allow you to do, one, a whole building LCA, which what these tools are developed for? They're very complex tools that include way more than concrete. But, are there other tools that you could just look at concrete using those tools?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you can certainly use the Athena Impact Estimator if you're familiar with it. Agreed that some of those tools are complex. There are also other whole building LCA tools like One-Click LCA and Tally. You could certainly use the EC3 tool if you know your product-specific EPD for your mix to calculate, just concrete. Climate Earth actually also has a building calculator built in. So if you have developed your EPDs with Climate Earth, they also have an additional tool for calculating the concrete scope of a specific project. And there are certainly other tools that are potentially being developed to just simplify that process. You could also always use an Excel spreadsheet.
Excellent. Well, we've run out of time. Great questions and great presentations from everybody. So that really concludes the first session of Concrete Innovations. I would like to thank all of the attendees along with our speakers and sponsors for excellent presentations. Our next session is scheduled for May 4th at 11 a.m. Eastern. And so I'd urge you to please visit concreteinnovations.com to register for the next session and future sessions, because we do have all those sessions scheduled out. We will publish a recording of this session. Might take a few days to get that. Also, like I said, we'll publish the presentations themselves. And of course, the continuing education form is on the website right on the first homepage. So you download if you want a certificate of completion for this session. I'd also suggest you to visit the website because there are some excellent product spotlight briefings from each of the sponsors there, and some of the questions that you asked can be answered by simply downloading brochures or visiting the websites or contacting the people designated to answer questions on the product spotlights there. So with that, I would just welcome all of you for the next session. We look forward to seeing you there, and thanks to everybody for participating today.